Hello. Today I'm going to be talking about social evolution with a particular focus on trying to capture some of the complexity of how real organisms actually behave. Before I get going, I'd just like to point out this was work conducted as part of my PhD, so I'd like to thank my funder, my host institution, the University of Bath, and my supervisor especially, as well as my current employers who allowed me to take some time out to go and do this. Now, the big picture problem that I want to address and what this paper that I'm going to be talking about tries to address is one of group beneficial behaviours. This is a problem that is studied in numerous different fields under various different guises for a very long time. Group beneficial behaviour, as the name implies, is where an individual pays a cost to benefit the group as a whole, from which an individual reaps a return as a member of that group. And the basic dilemma here is that individuals may reap the benefits of group beneficial behaviour irrespective of whether or not they have paid a cost to produce it, which creates an incentive for free riding or cheating. When we think about the real biological examples of this kind of problem, we must recognise there are all sorts of solutions to the problem of group beneficial behaviour that leads to it becoming advantageous and leading to it persisting despite the threat of cheating. And these solutions have ranged from things which are probably very familiar, like high relatedness, and things which maybe we're less familiar with, like strong reciprocity. But as social context varies, it's often the case that the optimal level of cheating or cooperating also varies. For example, perhaps most simply in the slime mold Dictyostelium discoideum, it could be that two strains of amoeba may come together at different frequencies within a group, whereupon we would expect that the optimal allocation of selfish spore and altruistic stalk cells is dependent upon a strain's frequencies. So rather than being a solution per se, what we call strategic cooperation, which is both quantitative and conditional, simply varies with social context. Coarse scale strategic cooperation has been demonstrated in numerous systems, perhaps best in mice and aphids, but fine-scale strategic cooperation has been demonstrated in microbes, which suggests that it is simple and so could be common across the tree of life if it is looked for. Strategic cooperation is also really important because it explains why cooperation can persist even though cheating is advantageous, which many of these other solutions to the problem of group beneficial behaviour don't always look at. And it kind of explains some of the discrepancies we see between lab results and field studies. So in this paper that I'm presenting, we look at a very simple model of group beneficial behaviour using public goods, which are a general class of game theoretic models where individuals pay a cost to deliver a group benefit. To model this situation as simply and generally as possible, we focus on the selection of a gene for strategic cooperation that is found at variable frequencies within a group. And this is because the gene that modulates its strategy based on its frequency in the group is going to be some kind of greenbeard or kin discrimination mechanism. But note that we are assuming that the social context that the gene finds itself in is independent of that gene's frequency. This means that a gene is naturally selected to maximize its fitness in response to its frequency within a group, as we should expect. This setup permits the conditional element of strategic cooperation, but we must also permit quantitative levels of cooperation. And here we encounter a problem that many of the classic models of public goods take an additive structure. So here we have an individual gets fitness, something to do with some unity minus cost, reflecting its own strategy, noted here with an I, and then gets some benefit relating to the group's strategy, noted here with a G. This leads to a threshold effect, where we see that an individual invests fully in beneficial behaviour once it surpasses a critical frequency threshold, which is clearly not going to be very realistic in nature, although it is very simple. Actually, there's no reason why the level of cooperation that has been selected here is purely arbitrary, depends on the model. It's just one. So it doesn't really capture the real biology of what's going on, where we expect that there is a particular optimal level. To get that more complex nuance into the model, we have to use this multiplicative setup, which takes the same kind of setup. It's just purely that it leads to some kind of optimal level of allocation in this quantitative strategy. So this is the model we're going to use for our strategic cooperation. And we use a very simple framework which considers all of the parameters we've just discussed. We have this group benefit, we have a personal cost of the player from their own strategy, have a certain number of players in the group. So here we suppose we'd be talking about alleles as our players, and these alleles are present at different frequencies within the group, and each individual allele has a particular strategy, and then the group level strategy is just the sum of an individual's frequency weighted strategy. So this strategy, very critically, is variable across frequencies. And we want to know what this strategy looks like. So what we can do is we can take the equation for fitness and we can solve the maximum, and we end up with an ESS that looks like this. Now, this ESS is actually incomplete. What that means is that it isn't actually telling us what an individual player should invest, because it's still dependent upon this group level term. And this turns out to be a really thorny problem. But before we go into any detail, let's just consider what this equation is telling us first off. From a kin selection perspective, we can look at the ESS, just taking the ESS and saying what condition does the ESS become greater than 0? So what condition do we expect an individual to cooperate at some level? And you arrive at something that looks very similar to Hamilton's rule, which has an RB minus C element. Here the frequency term is taking on the element of R, as you would expect in this context. But there's also this additional term at the end here, which seems to be representing something to do with the conflict between an individual and what the group does. There is a conflict taking place. And when we model what this looks like, just to simulate and find out what the general flavor of these equations look like, we can look at the ESS and find that in some contexts, actually this third part doesn't really matter. This is when the B term is very small, because it means the individual has to have a very high frequency, whereupon it's the only player with that frequency, with a high enough frequency, for it to invest at all. There are lots of other contexts, and this is the majority of contexts really, where we see that there is quite substantial difference between what a player does incorporating this ESS term, this third part here in the red, and the term which just incorporates the blue parts. There's a huge difference here between the condition where an individual actually invests, which does have an impact on how we consider how to analyze additive models when they often ignore that additional element. One of the first things we did in order to go and think about how to break down the ESS to find a more informative analytical solution was just to simulate. And these simulations provide the basis for understanding that there is convergence to the ESS. And we can show this by looking at the range of conditions which we arrive at the ESS under. This is always an approximation, but it does provide some confidence that we can indeed arrive at a more informative analytical solution for the ESS. But a real problem is that we still have to break down that group component. We can do that very easily for a two-player instance, but it gets very much harder when considering more than two players. And for those situations, it is much more informative to look at a more general approach trying to solve the ESS. So we did this by developing a novel methodology, which we called the co-ESS methodology, because it utilized the ESS that a group has. So effectively at the group level, we have all the other individuals in that group pursuing the ESS. They play the ESS strategy given their frequency. This leads to a particular group level phenomenon, which is what we call the co-ESS of collective investment by that group of players pursuing the ESS. And this is a really important step forward because it enables us to break down the co-ESS. And so this is here formally what we're going to be calling the co-ESS, which is the group level strategy, which is the equivalent status as the ESS for individuals. But we have to do these two extra terms, which are two group level statistics. The first is the number of players in the group that contribute to the group beneficial behavior. And the second is the average frequency of the players that are contributing towards the group beneficial behavior. With these terms, we can then substitute this back into the ESS and arrive at a very informative analytical solution, which is really useful because these two terms, the number of players that contribute towards group beneficial behavior and the average frequency of those players, can be derived without simulation. And this enables us to understand something about what is varying in these contexts in order to bring about certain effects. So one of the most interesting things that we found was that there is fitness invariance to frequencies. So all the contributors, all the players which are performing some non-zero level of cooperation have the same return on their investment. And what this means is that they end up with the same transmission going forward, the same frequency-weighted fitness, which is often viewed as their frequency in the next generation, which is a really interesting result because it suggests that there is some kind of negative frequency dependence at play, where we see that a contributor with a low frequency ends up with a higher fitness. And this then counterbalances and could potentially provide a mechanism to explain polymorphism in these alleles, which are defining the number of players in the system. Another really interesting perspective to go and take a look at, so we've already looked at this kin selection perspective, we can also take a group selection or multi-level selection perspective. And this can actually be very informative in this context. So when we do this, we see there are certain parameters which are having the same effect when varied on individual investment and collective investment. So for example, if we increase the benefit term, it increases the amount of investment we expect by an individual, and also it increases the amount of investment we expect by the group. And the opposite happens for costs. But some of these other terms have slightly more complicated patterns. For example, the frequency term, which isn't actually found in the collective investment equation, increases the level of investment we expect by an individual player. And equivalently at the group level, we might consider the average contributor frequency. And this increases the level of collective investment. So there is kind of symmetry going on here. But actually, this average contributor frequency has opposite effects on individuals' desire to invest and the collective investment of the group. This means that the strategies are misaligned in that what is good for the individual is not always going to be good for the group, which explains the fundamental paradox within group beneficial behaviour. But also is illuminating because it tells us about the degree to which there is misalignment. So for example, very simply, if there was only one player in the group, so one allele present within the group, there is no conflict between these two. Another really interesting element which came out of the model was that the relevant information for strategists is often assumed just simply to be their own frequency, which is how the green beard effect was first described and so on. It's been suggested that genes would gather information about their own frequency, but there is an additional element in our model which becomes really apparent that social context is not just about an individual's frequency, it's also about what other players are doing within that group. Consequently, we might expect that a gene would benefit from gaining information about, say, the number of other alleles present within a group, because the difference can be really extreme, as we saw in the kin selection perspective context where we looked at that conflict term. This predicts that individuals might actually benefit from gaining information about some of the other contextual information about groups, which is a prediction which currently we don't know of any plausible mechanism for, but is interesting speculation. So just to quickly summarize some of what we've talked through, we use this co-ESS methodology, which enabled us to derive a more informative analytical solution for the ESS and analyze really what's going on within this model of a slightly intractable system of this multiplicative setup where there is quantitative cooperation. And what this shows is that there is this fitness invariance property which could potentially maintain polymorphism as a solution to Cauchy's paradox. There is misalignment between the levels, and this shows that actually some parameters appear to be more relevant to particular levels than others. And also that the relevant information to an individual must incorporate both levels, and it must incorporate something about what an individual's own frequency is, and also something about the group level properties. On that note, I'd just like to point you towards this paper. This paper, which this talk is based on, provides a very interesting framework for analysing all kinds of public goods problems, as well as trying to bring together lots of other ideas which are already present within the literature within a single model, and provides a very simple framework for thinking about all sorts of problems relating to the social evolution of group beneficial behaviours. Thank you for listening.